You've read this work. What, in your view, characterizes it? It is a work that shows astonishment at the reality of rural life. It shows a young man's passion. It shows a disdain for doctrinal disputes and an indifference to theoretical implications of his finding. You may remember that the Comintern Party line declared unequivocally that the, quote, proletariat is the only class in a position to carry on any radical agrarian policy. Marx had once written about the idiocy of rural life. Lenin saw it as assisting, but not a motor force in revolution. Stalin had written that the part of initiator and guide of the Chinese Revolution must inevitably fall into the hands of the Chinese proletariat. What does Mao say? Let me ask you this. What does Mao say about the proletariat in his report? What does he say? That's right, nothing. There's not even a passing reference to proletariat. So who is the revolutionary vanguard according to Mao? It was not the proletariat, but peasants, farmers, and not just farmers, but the poorest of the poor, the riffraff of society. According to Mao, if there are 10 elements in making revolution, the poor peasantry gets 7. And what he saw as the real objective of the revolution was not the overthrow of imperialism or of warlordism, those two central objectives of the nationalist revolution. It was more basic. It was the overthrow of the existing rural order. The real enemy of the revolution was not the one identified by Stalin or by the Comintern, that is, the Communist International, but rather, quote, the patriarchal feudal class of local bullies and bad gentry, that is to say, traditional ruling elites in the countryside. And he said of the peasants' eyes are perfectly discerning, and it was the task of the party to develop policy and to accommodate this revolutionary upsurge. Now, this tells you a lot about Mao Zedong. It's a very Chinese-centered view of the world. It's a Chinese-centered view of revolution, a Chinese revolutionary process only indirectly related to world revolutionary processes, at least as interpreted by Moscow and by Stalin. And Mao himself had no conception as to how it would actually be carried out. He was, however, convinced that it would be a bloody, prolonged affair. Revolution would not succeed simply by gaining the heights of power, as Lenin had done in St. Petersburg and Moscow in the Soviet Union. As Mao famously wrote, a revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely, so genteel, so temperate, so kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. And a rural revolution is a revolution by which the peasantry overthrows the power of the feudal landlord class. Now, months after writing this essay, Mao tried it out. He tried his hand at rural revolution in the so-called Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hunan, his home province. And it was crushed in a week. Mao was arrested. Fortunate for him, he was able to bribe his way out. The peasants of whom he wrote in Hunan were systematically massacred. From this, and indeed from the general experience of the Kuomintang Purge of 1927, he learned at least one important lesson: that political power comes from the barrel of a gun. And thus his party would also need an army. With what little was left of Hunanese and other local communists, maybe 1,000 people, Mao did not return to the city and go underground as others in the communist leadership did. He did what many peasant rebels have done throughout Chinese history. He established a base area in an inaccessible region in the borders between provinces, in the Jingganshan Mountains between Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. There he teamed up with a gentleman named Zhu De, a professional military man, really some say a former bandit and petty warlord, to found a revolutionary army a Red Army which would consist of less than 10,000 ill-clothed soldiers with maybe 2,000 guns. What he needed was security and time. Security from Chiang Kai-shek's White Terror, and time to experiment in revolution, to experiment in which the whole of southern Jiangxi province would be the laboratory. And by November of 1931, he founded what he called, after a period of consolidation, the Chinese Soviet Republic in Jiangxi province. Then he came under pressure from two sides. From Chiang Kai-shek, now leader of the country, who between 1931 and 1934 launched 5 encirclement and suppression campaigns to extinguish the reborn communist threat. And indeed, from the Chinese communist leadership itself and from the Comintern in Moscow that increasingly saw Mao as a peasant adventurist, not a real Marxist. The Politburo didn't want to experiment. It wanted a faster nationwide revolution. By 1934, most of the Politburo had migrated to Jiangxi, where they pulled rank, seized control of operations, and actually arrested Mao briefly in July of 1934. But by October of 1934, this so-called Jiangxi Soviet was all but destroyed anyway, and the party almost entirely devastated, thanks to the encirclement campaigns of Chiang Kai-shek. The communists, or some part of the communist military, broke out of the encirclement campaign on October of 1934 and fled, not sure at all of where they were going. At its height, the Red Army in Jiangxi numbered perhaps as many as 300,000 soldiers ruling some 3 million people. By the time they escaped the nationalist encirclement, only 85,000 troops, 15,000 government and party officials, that's a lot of government and party officials, and only 35 women remained. All the rest were left behind to nationalist guns, including 2 of Mao's children. Thus began the famous Long March, which was, in fact, a devastating retreat across China that would conclude over 1 year later and thousands of miles later in Shanxi province. Of the 100,000 or so who started out, only 8,000 survived.